Hey guys, I'm Tyler and welcome back. Today we are going to be making a twin bed out of ash. This bed is made out of solid ash, and I got rough cut ash from a local sawmill here in southeast Michigan. After finding the best grain patterns for the rails and the legs of this bed, I moved over to the miter saw station to make rough cuts using the miter saw. And then it was over to the jointer and planer to get 2 square faces before moving on to the finer machinery. Yes, it is a lot of work to get dimension lumber down to the S4S that you need, but it does save you a ton of money. Some of the pieces were quite a bit thicker than I needed, and instead of throwing all of those chips into the planer dustbin, it was faster to resaw it on the bandsaw and then go back over to the planer. Once everything was all milled down to its proper dimension, I marked everything according to my plans so that I didn't mix anything up. And then all the pieces were run over the table saw to bring them down to their final dimensions. And then it was back over to the miter saw, and with the use of the miter stop block, I cut all of the pieces down to their final length, and some of them even had a nice designed angle on them just to give it a nice architectural look. The top head and footboard rails have a long sloping curve in them, and I made this curve using an 1/8 inch piece of plywood and some spring clamps, and then just drew it in place with a pencil. Then it was over to the bandsaw to cut that curve, and then the oscillating spindle sander to clean it up. And I'm going to be using Rockler Woodworking and Hardware's BeadLock system to assemble the head and footboards of this twin bed. It is a loose mortise and tenon joinery system, and the most difficult thing about it is wrapping your head around the measurements needed to put the mortises in the proper locations. I started by marking out on the legs where I needed my rails to connect to. I always like to check with the rails themselves to make sure I have my measurements correct. And then using a beadlock tenon itself, you need to mark the middle of the location where you need that mortise. And this is just an eyeball measurement in the middle of your rail boards. You need to mark on both pieces. In Rockler's instructions, they do label these pieces A and B, and it is good to keep track of that because that dictates the amount of times that you drill the beadlock and then how you shift the mechanism itself. Then placing the beadlock system onto my boards, I clamped it lightly in place and adjusted the guide mechanism to those lines that I just measured. And then based on the width of the loose tenon that you are using, it dictates the holes that you need to drill. The first drill sequence, I drilled 3 holes, and then loosened and shifted over the guide mechanism and drilled the 2 remaining holes. One thing I did find with this system is I got a much cleaner hole if I used a brad point drill bit. That is not what is supplied in the beadlock system, but it just gives you a much cleaner cut. This video has been sponsored by Rockler Woodworking and Hardware, and you see me use a bunch of their items in this video, but probably the coolest one is this new beadlock system. It was a little bit tricky to get all the measurements down, but once I wrapped my head around this thing was super cool and very easy to get all of the loose mortise and tenon joinery done for this bed. This thing will rival something like a domino at a much better price. Rockler Woodworking and Hardware is your source for all sorts of woodworking and finishing and hardware needs. Things like the clamps, things like the finish that I put on this bed, and even the router table. Be sure to check them out either in store or at rockler.com. Once I had all of my mortises cut, I moved over to the router to put a slight round over and soften up those edges. And then it was on to sanding, and I sanded everything up to 180 grit using my 6-inch random orbit sander. The first steps of the assembly will be the rails themselves, and this small lip is to allow the slats to hold the mattress in place to be rested upon. This is just glued and brad nailed into place. And then it was on to assembling the head and footboard using the beadlock system that we already drilled the mortises for. I first put in some glue, made sure I had nice even application, and then hammered my beadlock tenons into place and made sure I had a liberal amount of glue on the exposed tongue as well. I then fitted my pieces together and used some parallel clamps to make sure everything was nice and snug. And as always, the time spent cleaning now will give you a much better finished product later. This bed is going to be capable of being knocked down, and for that I'm using the Rockler Woodworking and Hardware Bed Kit. Link to that down in the description below if you would be so interested. I first measured the location to drill a pilot hole and then came back with this massive drill bit to drill for a threaded insert. If I would have had the time, this would have been best to do with a brad point bit, so you would have had more directional control and a cleaner cut. But either way, I got the threaded insert in there and we are all set with the head and footboard. Then it is time to move on to the rails, where you will need to use a Forstner bit to drill a big hole to allow the threaded rod to go into this hole and to be bolted down. And then we're going to have a hole coming in from the opposite side where you see that mark right now, and that is going to allow the threaded rod to go in. I drilled pilot holes for all of these to prevent my bits from wandering, and then came in with the proper sizes. Here you can see I am using a 1/2 inch brad point bit, much better control and a much cleaner cut. Obviously this is done on all 4 ends of your rails. Once the main holes were done, I came back with a brad point bit and drilled partially through, and this will be for a wooden dowel. And this is actually what takes all of the load from the rails and transfers it to the head and footboard. I probably didn't need to use the threaded rod in this case, but it does give me horizontal alignment, and for the vertical alignment I carefully measured the proper location and then used some dowel transferring pins to transfer those holes directly into the head and footboard, and then followed that up by drilling the holes partly through with a brad point bit. And then moving on to finishing the bed, and for that I'm going to be using General Finishes and Duravar in a semi-gloss sheen. This has an amber tint in it, so it is 1 coat of water-based finish, so it's super fast to dry, and it still gives you that amber tint like you used an oil base. And I'm going to be spraying that using my Fuji Q5 Platinum sprayer. Simply the only way to apply finish to a project. Super fast and a great even finish. Once the finish had cured sufficiently, the kids and I moved the bed up into their bedroom, and it was time for final assembly. Threaded rods put into place, wooden dowels in their permanent location, and then the bolt and the oddly shaped U-washer were bolted into place, allowing a knockdown bed to be assembled rather quickly. And then a couple of pine slats for the mattress support. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please hammer that thumbs up button. While you got your hammer out, why don't you ring the bell so that you are notified of the latest project videos. I'm DIYTyler, and you guys have a good one.